400. In 2012, there were more than 400 shooting deaths by police officers in the United States. In fact, in recent years, even the most conservative estimates put that number at 300 to 400 killings by police officers a year in this country. Now, when most people think about police force issues, they think about it in terms of, was the force excessive or was it appropriate? Well, when I think about police force issues and the fatal use of force by police officers, I think of it as a sentencing issue, and I call it the death penalty on the streets. Let's take the situation in Ferguson, Missouri, for example. Now, I, like many of you, felt a mix of emotions when I heard that Michael Brown had been killed by a police officer in August of this year. I was saddened, right, by the loss of a young life, the pain that his parents must feel. I was angered by yet another young black man, unarmed, being killed by police officers. I was frustrated as I heard discussions on both sides about whether Michael was surrendering with his hands up or whether he was attacking the police officer. And frankly, I was very concerned when I saw the rioting that was happening in Ferguson and when I saw the military-like response to that rioting. And so as I listened to the news and I heard the discussions, I just kept thinking, we're missing something. There's a sentencing issue here that we're not talking about. There's a sentencing issue that's going without all of the protections that we give to sentencing in our courts. This is the death penalty. It's just the death penalty on the streets. Now, to understand my perspective, it's probably important for you all to know that I'm a sentencing scholar. So I'm a law professor who teaches, writes, researches, and speaks on sentencing issues. So I do tend to look at the world with sentencing on my mind. But I really do think that if we think about all of the protections that we give in the punishment context and move those to some of the social issues that we're encountering in our country, I really do think there's something to learn, and it would be a new way to look at something, and it really shows us what's at stake and what needs to be done. So I think about this as the death penalty on the streets, and I just want to explain to you what I mean by that. So what do I mean by the death penalty on the streets? Well, let's just start by what the death penalty is. So the death penalty is anytime the government punishes someone by taking their life. What's punishment? Well, punishment is when the government takes our life, liberty, or property as a response to our objectionable behavior. Now, that term, life, liberty, or property, it might sound familiar to you, and that's because it's from the United States Constitution. Now, the Constitution says that the government cannot take our life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that just means some sort of fair court proceeding. And that's just what criminal punishment is. So, if you commit some minor crime, the government can fine you. That's taking your property, your money. And if you commit perhaps a more serious offense, you can be imprisoned. Well, that's taking your liberty. And if you commit the most serious offense of all, the intentional murder of someone, well, the government can take your very life. That's the death penalty. Okay, so that's why I say that when police officers, government officials, acting in their duty as law enforcement officials, the enforcers of our laws, when that person kills someone, that's the death penalty. It's just the death penalty on the streets. Now, there's something else from the United States Constitution that you've probably heard of, and that's that we're all free from cruel and unusual punishment. So, the Supreme Court has interpreted cruel and unusual punishment, our freedom from that, as meaning that punishment has to comport with human dignity. It has to respect the rights of people and their lives, even if they've been convicted of a crime. And so when it comes to the death penalty, the Supreme Court has put in lots of protections so that human dignity is still protected. One such protection is that punishment has to be proportional to the crime. So this applies to the death penalty as well. So the death penalty, according to the Supreme Court, can only apply in the most narrow of cases where the offense is so serious that the offender is not even deserving of life. And this is just supposed to be a small series of cases, a small percentage of cases. And why? Well, it's because the death penalty is our most serious offense. It is severe. It is final. And so we only apply it in the worst of the worst situations. So, obviously then, the death penalty couldn't apply to any of these offenses. Right? I mean, it would be unconstitutional for the death penalty to apply to any of these. But this list just so happens to be the list of underlying offenses for which people were killed by police officers in recent years. Now, I also have there on the screen an example of some of the types of punishments that would apply to these offenses if the person were actually charged with these offenses and convicted in court. Take a minute to look at them. They range from no penalty at all, right, to up to 7 years in prison. None of these are even close to the death penalty. Yet the people suspected of these offenses were killed. Let's take Michael Brown. What crime did he commit? Well, after the shooting, there were news accounts that he was suspected of stealing cigars from a store. Well, if those cigars were worth less than $500, that's a misdemeanor. So at most, he could get 1 year in prison, 1 year in jail. Now, that's not even why officers say that they stopped Michael Brown. They said that they stopped him because he was crossing the street and impeding traffic. So that was the beginning of their encounter. That's a misdemeanor too. And in fact, you wouldn't even be punished for that in most cases. But if he actually were prosecuted for that offense, then it's a misdemeanor, and at most, under Missouri law, it would be 15 days in jail. That's it. Now, of course, Officer Wilson will say that that's not why he killed Michael, right? That he killed Michael because he was attacking him, threatening his life. So if we take that version of events, then at a minimum, that's aggravated assault of a police officer. At the most, attempted murder. Well, under Missouri law and the law of most states in this country, for a first-time offender, even the most serious felony assault with intent to kill would carry up to 15 years in prison because the officer wasn't injured. And even if the officer had been injured, well, that can carry life imprisonment, but what it can't carry is the death penalty. What was Michael's punishment? Death. A cruel punishment disproportionate to his suspected offense. And I say suspected offense because in Michael's case, as in the case of these police killings, the suspect never gets the chance to have any of these offenses proven against him in court. He doesn't get the chance to have the state actually satisfy their burden of proof. The death penalty is imposed. And the really sad thing is that in many of these cases, after the fact, it turns out that the police officer was completely wrong in his or her assessment of the situation. The person was unarmed. They weren't trying to kill. But it's too late. The death penalty has been imposed, and it's final. Now, another protection that we get from the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the Constitution is that the death penalty can't be imposed in an arbitrary or mandatory manner. And so this means that even if a jury decides that somebody has committed intentional murder, the jury can't impose the death penalty, or they can't be forced to impose the death penalty. They have to have the choice to impose a sentence less than death. So they get to hear evidence about the person's upbringing, their character, their motive, things like that. basically to really assess the situation and to say, does this person really deserve to die despite what they've done? And in this country, in capital cases, the death penalty is actually only imposed in about 2% of cases where it could be. So it's really that narrowly used. That's in the death penalty in the courts. But in the death penalty on the streets? Well, in the death penalty on the streets, the suspect never gets the chance to tell you that he's a doting, loving father. Or he's just a kid. Or really anything at all that says he's a human being deserving of life despite what he's done. Now, in our system, in the courts, when the death penalty is imposed, even the most cold-blooded killer gets the chance to do that. So, in our system, even if someone is charged with and convicted of intentional homicide, intentional murder, and even after hearing evidence, if the jury decides that that person does deserve the death penalty, well, the protections don't end there. Because the Constitution, under the Cruel and Unusual Punishment Clause, the Supreme Court has said this also means that executions can't be carried out in an inhumane manner. So this is why the government can't behead us or dismember us or otherwise torture us as a way of imposing the death penalty. That's in the death penalty in the courts. But in the death penalty on the streets, well, in the death penalty in the streets, we have a situation like Eric Garner's, where he screamed out, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," 11 times as officers held him in a chokehold, killing him. John Crawford's girlfriend said they shot him like he wasn't even human. John Crawford picked up a toy gun in Walmart and was killed while he was on the phone with his girlfriend who was in another part of the store. And Michael Bell's father said that the police officer who killed his son held the muzzle of the gun so close to his son's temple that it left a muzzle imprint there. And of course, we have Michael Brown. Michael Brown's body was left just lying in the street, uncovered, for over 4 hours after he was killed. All inhumane executions, all cruel and unusual punishment. So when we think about it that way, when we think about the police's use of fatal force as a death penalty issue, then we can't just sweep it under the rug as simply a police safety issue. Sure, police have an important and dangerous job, but at the end of the day, they are the government, and they have to act within constitutional limitations, which means we just have to hold them to a higher standard. If we're going to take it seriously that we have a constitutional protection of our life, then we really do have to demand that there are conversations fruitful conversations about police training and rules and regulations that will call for the non-fatal use of force as a means of containment, as a first response, and as our expected response. We have to expect that. After all, we are all supposed to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. But we have over 400 reasons a year to question whether we really are.